My brother, yes. According to Michael, he would tell me he would see my father beating my mother. Because I am a victim myself, and I know what it feels like. And these kids are going to be scarred for the rest of their life. And I don't want to see any more innocent small children being affected this way. I love Michael very dearly, but I feel even more sorry for these children because they don't have a life anymore.
LaToya Jackson has revealed something that changes everything for the Jacksons. Unlike the other members of the Jackson family, LaToya has not been shy about exposing her family's abuse controversies that have been kept behind closed doors.
I've been hurt by it too. My father molested me. I don't like it. I don't like the way it feels. And to this day, this is my husband, and he can vouch for this. I will not have a relationship with him because of that.
She accused her father, Joe Jackson, of physical abuse, claiming that his abuse extended to everyone, including their mother.
But I think it's sad because I am a victim myself, and I know what it feels like. And these kids are going to be scarred for the rest of their life, and I don't want to see any more innocent small children being affected this way.
She also distanced herself from Michael Jackson during neither supporting nor condemning her brother, unlike the other family members. Could it be that she knows more and chose to distance herself from her family because of that? Let's dig into that. In December 1993, LaToya Jackson stood before a sea of microphones and cameras in Tel Aviv, Israel. Her voice was controlled, but the message was not. This was personal.
Oh no, Michael, from the man in the moon.
Okay, one more time.
Shake your head.
Talking to me.
I'm talking to you. Yes, I am.
I don't know, Michael. You sit, look at you, got no respect for no one. You can't even respect your own family.
In that moment, LaToya Jackson began unraveling decades of family secrets, exposing claims of abuse, manipulation, and silence that would change how the world viewed the Jacksons forever.
But I choose not to answer.
Okay.
And I have my reasons for it.
Okay.
And you guys should not say a word to people that I hear sighing. You know why? You have not lived in the same house with me. You do not know what goes on in my house. You have not been there. If you were there and you know what goes on, then let me hear you say something.
She stopped being just Michael Jackson's sister and became the family's most controversial figure. She said she had stayed silent for years, but now she was speaking out about, not about music, not about fame, but what she claimed went on inside the Jackson family home, specifically the physical abuse they suffered at the hands of their father, Joe Jackson, of physical abuse.
But I think it's sad because I am a victim myself, and I know what it feels like. And these kids are going to be scarred for the rest of their life, and I don't want to see any more innocent small children being affected this way.
She also implied that the pattern of abuse extended beyond just beatings, saying there were darker elements, ones no one in the family wanted to admit. She even claimed her mother, Catherine, had suffered too.
She didn't stop it.
She too was an abuse victim, wasn't she?
My
Sometimes?
mother, by my father, according to my brother, yes. According to Michael, he would tell me he would see my father beating my mother. I have never seen my father.
That single sentence set the media on fire, and the world divided. Some felt she was being courageous. Others believed she had been manipulated by her then-husband and manager, Jack Gordon, a man later accused of isolating her, controlling her finances, and even abusing her himself. For the Jackson family, the damage was immediate. Michael, who at the time was facing his own public scrutiny and child molestation allegations, was reportedly devastated. He called LaToya's statements lies and cut off communication. Catherine Jackson released a statement calling her daughter brainwashed, and Joe Jackson flat out denied every allegation. But LaToya insisted she was telling the truth, and that what she witnessed and experienced had haunted her for years. She claimed the family had a long-standing tradition of covering things up to protect the brand. In one interview, she said, "We were trained to lie, to act like everything was fine. That's what showbiz families do." For some, it sounded like bitterness. For others, it sounded too specific to be made up. The public didn't know what to believe, but the streets were already picking sides. In many black households, the talk wasn't just about LaToya's press conference. It was about the culture of silence, power, and respectability. The streets were saying what LaToya described wasn't rare, just rarely spoken out loud. But behind the headlines and interviews, LaToya was facing a private hell. Her husband at the time, Jack Gordon, was said to have orchestrated the press conference. Years later, LaToya admitted in her memoir that Gordon had physically and emotionally abused her and pushed her to turn against her family publicly.
Why did you marry your husband?
Because I had to.
Why?
Because my parents had kidnap attempts out after me, which I didn't believe. And the only way that I could protect myself is to have the last name Gordon. And I was performing one night and
So now the question lingered. Was LaToya exposing the truth or being used to destroy it? In 1996, she escaped Gordon and returned to the Jackson family. But by then, the damage had been done. The public image of the perfect showbiz dynasty had cracked, and LaToya was the one who hit it with the first blow. That clip hit differently. Years after the headlines faded, LaToya wasn't denying what she said, but now she was adding context. She said she had been under control, manipulated. But the stories she told about her childhood, she still stood by them.
About your family.
Or have friends or anything. Wow. He told me I'm never going back, that now I'm his and he's controlling me, and that's basically what he did.
And to this day, the streets are still split. Some believe she was the first Jackson to tell the truth. Others believe she went too far. But one thing is clear. In 1993, LaToya Jackson did what no one else in her family dared. She spoke up. After the 1993 press conference, LaToya Jackson was everywhere. Headlines, interviews, sound bites. But behind the cameras, she was quietly disappearing. Not from fame, from herself. The voice people thought was bold and rebellious wasn't free. It was being controlled. Jack Gordon, her manager and husband, had positioned himself as her protector. But court documents and LaToya's later statements revealed a darker reality. She said Gordon was violent, controlling, and cut her off from her family completely. Over the next several years, LaToya Jackson lived under what many would later call emotional captivity. Under Gordon's management, LaToya posed for Playboy. She appeared in staged interviews, bashing her siblings. She was even filmed denying the molestation allegations against Michael in ways that would haunt her reputation later. Many didn't realize those statements weren't just controversial. They were, in her words, forced.
We knew that it wasn't going to last because it wasn't a marriage out of love. I definitely wanted a divorce without a doubt.
The relationship with Jack Gordon wasn't just emotionally damaging. According to police reports and LaToya's memoir, it turned physically violent too. She described multiple incidents of abuse, including one night in 1993, where she says Gordon hit her with a chair and left her locked in a hotel room for days.
He would tell me, now go in the closet, and I would literally sit in the closet for hours until he came back. That's how much fear he had instilled in me. Yeah. And there were certain days that he'd come back and just look and say, I'm just checking to see if you didn't leave the closet.
Gordon.
This marriage was never really meant to be, and we have always been friends, and we still are friends, and I have always waited and wanted a divorce. And yes, we are going to get a divorce.
To a lot of people, the marriage of LaToya Jackson and her manager, Jack Gordon, never did make a lot of sense. Well, evidently, it doesn't make sense to them either anymore. As Scott Rappaport tells us, it's Splitsville.
The more she obeyed him, the more distant she became from her family, and the more the public turned on her. While the Jacksons remained silent, LaToya became a running tabloid punchline. To some, she was an attention seeker. To others, a traitor. But the streets were saying something else. In corners of the culture where manipulation and abuse were recognized for what they were, the whispers started to grow louder. That girl's not crazy, something's wrong behind the scenes. And it was. In 1996, LaToya finally broke free. She escaped Gordon while in New York, running to a friend's house with no money, no ID, and no security. With the help of her brother Randy and others, she quietly began the process of rebuilding her life and reconnecting with the family she had once publicly denounced.
I took my pajama bottoms on, put on a pair of pants, and just left like that without nothing. I left with absolutely nothing.
Her return wasn't explosive. It wasn't televised. It was private and complicated. But slowly, the Jackson family accepted her back. They understood the depths of the control she had been under. And while not every relationship healed overnight, the silence between them began to lift.
When did you start to feel estranged from the family? Because we need to cover that area, because I mean that's where all your battling began as well. That's how you can start over now, because you came over that. I mean, you dealt with that. But where did you feel? When did that start, the estrangement?
Publicly, LaToya started correcting the record. She admitted she had been manipulated. She apologized to Michael, to her parents, to her siblings. But she didn't take back everything. She stood by the abuse allegations against her father. She maintained that her childhood was painful, and she continued to speak out. Only this time as herself. That moment said it all. The abuse she experienced in her marriage didn't erase the trauma, she says, began at home. It just added to it. By the early 2000s, LaToya was no longer the outcast. She was seen as a survivor. The tabloids changed their tune. The interviews shifted tone. People who once laughed started listening. And the streets? They started saying she might have been right all along. Because when someone risks everything to tell a painful truth and still chooses to stand by it after the chaos clears, that says something. When LaToya Jackson returned to her family in 1996, she wasn't welcomed with open arms right away. Too much had been said. Too much trust had been broken. But time and truth would slowly begin to rebuild what had been shattered. Behind closed doors, the Jacksons had always operated by one unspoken rule: keep family business private. For years, LaToya was the only one who broke that code. And even after she admitted she had been controlled and manipulated, some wounds didn't heal overnight. Some were still raw.
It was my manager, the management, which was, I never like to say his name because it was such a bad influence, and it was a control factor.
LaToya's relationship with her mother, Catherine, was the first to show signs of mending. According to LaToya, Catherine never gave up on her, even when she was being vilified in public. While Catherine publicly called her daughter's 1993 claims untrue, privately she remained concerned for LaToya's safety and well-being. But the real tension lay elsewhere, between LaToya and Michael. In the 1990s, while Michael was battling serious allegations and public scrutiny, LaToya had stood in front of cameras and accused him of terrible things. Even though she later said those statements were forced by her husband, the damage had already been done. Michael Jackson, known for his deep loyalty and sensitivity, didn't immediately forgive her. Friends close to the family said Michael felt betrayed. But as time passed, and as he saw the changes in his sister, the escape, the independence, the honesty, something shifted. In the early 2000s, the two reconnected. Quietly, carefully. It wasn't publicized. There were no interviews or press photos. But according to LaToya, the two began speaking again and slowly found peace. By the time Michael died in 2009, LaToya was by his side, publicly defending him, attending the memorial, and standing beside her family once more. Her bond with Janet, however, remained complicated. As the youngest and most private of the siblings, Janet Jackson rarely addressed family matters publicly. But insiders say she was deeply disappointed by LaToya's past statements, especially those involving Michael and Joe. In later years, LaToya said in interviews that she and Janet were cordial, but distant. "We speak, we love each other, but it's not the way it used to be." The tension with her father, Joe, never fully healed. Even after his death in 2018, LaToya remained firm in her claims about his treatment of the children. While some of her siblings defended Joe's strict parenting style as necessary for their success, LaToya described it as trauma. And that division ran through the family like a quiet current. Some supported LaToya's willingness to speak openly. Others chose to stay silent. In many ways, the Jackson family became a reflection of something bigger, the struggle between protecting legacy and confronting pain. The public may never know the full conversations that happened behind the scenes. But even in their rare united appearances, Michael's memorial, charity events, family lawsuits, there was always an underlying tension, the kind that comes from years of silence, conflicting truths, and unresolved grief. Despite that, LaToya never turned her back again. She didn't run to tabloids. She didn't call another press conference. Instead, she used her voice differently, writing a memoir, advocating for domestic abuse victims, and slowly rebuilding her reputation. But she never stopped telling her version of the truth, and in doing so, she forced the world to see the Jacksons not as a perfect pop dynasty, but as a complicated, deeply human family. A family with brilliance, yes, but also wounds. And to this day, the streets are still saying the realest one in the family might have been the one they tried hardest to silence. By the late 1980s, LaToya Jackson had already made a name for herself, not as a singer like Michael or Janet, but as a lightning rod for controversy. She was stepping away from the image the Jacksons had carefully maintained for decades, and many of her most polarizing decisions weren't made in isolation. They were made under pressure. In 1989, LaToya Jackson posed nude for Playboy magazine. She became the first member of the Jackson family to appear in such a publication. The issue sold extremely well and generated enormous media attention. In interviews at the time, LaToya defended the decision by saying she wanted to break out of the conservative mold she had grown up in. But years later, LaToya gave a different explanation. In her 2011 memoir, Starting Over, she said she was coerced into doing the photo shoot by her then-husband and manager, Jack Gordon. According to her, Gordon was both physically and emotionally abusive, and he used the photo shoot as a way to isolate her further from her family and maintain control over her public image. Between 1989 and 1996, while she was under Gordon's management, LaToya's public controversies escalated. In 1990, she and Gordon were arrested in Rome after allegedly assaulting hotel staff during a dispute over accommodations. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident further added to her reputation as unpredictable. It also marked a growing pattern. Every time LaToya appeared in the press, it wasn't about music. It was about shock, scandal, or confrontation. During this period, LaToya made appearances at casinos and clubs in Las Vegas, performing in risque cabaret shows. These performances were marketed in stark contrast to the Jackson family's image of discipline and showbiz polish. Promotional material often emphasized her Playboy appearance and played into the controversial persona Gordon had crafted. But behind the lights, LaToya later said she was miserable. In multiple interviews after escaping Gordon in 1996, she described being under constant surveillance, cut off from her family, and physically abused. According to her 2011 memoir and court filings, Gordon often beat her before shows and threatened her if she didn't follow his instructions. In 1993, LaToya made one of her most infamous public moves, a press conference in Israel, where she accused members of her own family of covering up abuse allegations against her brother, Michael Jackson. She also said she and her mother had both been victims of abuse at the hands of Joe Jackson, their father. At the time, the statements were widely condemned by her family. However, after leaving Gordon in 1996, LaToya said those public statements were also forced. She told media outlets that Gordon had threatened her life and forced her to say things that would permanently damage her relationship with her family. In a 1997 appearance on 2020, she revealed that Gordon would rehearse statements with her and demand she follow a script during interviews. In 2003, she began returning to the public stage on her own terms. In interviews with Oprah Winfrey, Larry King, and others, LaToya acknowledged her past controversies and clarified what had happened. When asked about her Playboy appearance, she said, LaToya didn't just focus on correcting her past, she also began advocating for domestic violence survivors, using her experience to speak out about the cycles of manipulation and fear. In 2011, she published Starting Over, a memoir that outlined her years under Gordon's control, her escape, and her process of healing.
Go back. And from that point onward, he started doing slightly little things. The abuse came, the control factor. No, you stay in your room, you don't do this, you say this. I never saw people, I never associated with anyone.
By the 2010s, the public's perception of LaToya had shifted. Instead of the scandal-prone outcast, she was increasingly seen as someone who had endured abuse, public ridicule, and family alienation, and who came out the other side willing to speak honestly. She still faced criticism. Some Jackson fans never forgave her for the 1993 press conference. Others questioned the timing of her revelations, but factually, there's no denying she had lived through years of public and private turmoil and slowly rebuilt her name. And today, when people revisit the most controversial chapters of her life, they do so with a different lens. One shaped by her own words, legal documents, interviews, and the quiet understanding that for years, the world didn't know what she was really living through. When people talk about the Jackson family today, most of the focus still falls on Michael, Janet, or their father Joe's legacy as a strict patriarch. But quietly, and with far less recognition, LaToya Jackson has spent the last 2 decades rewriting her place in that story, not through scandal, but through survival. After escaping Jack Gordon in 1996, LaToya filed for divorce and began rebuilding her life, emotionally, financially, and publicly. She returned to the United States with limited funds, no management, and a reputation that had been severely damaged by years of controlled media appearances.
This marriage was never really meant to be, and we have always been friends, and we still are friends, and I have always waited and wanted a divorce, and yes, we are going to get a divorce.
But over time, she began to reclaim her narrative using her own voice. In 2003, she appeared on Larry King Live, confirming the abuse she suffered under Gordon and reaffirming that many of the controversial statements she had made in the 1990s were made under duress. She told King, "Everything I said, I was told to say. I didn't have the freedom to speak for myself." She expanded further in her 2011 memoir, Starting Over. The book detailed her childhood, her strict upbringing, her years of isolation under Jack Gordon, and the process of recovering both her voice and identity. In the book, she stood firm on one major point. Her childhood had involved abuse, and she was no longer afraid to call it what it was. LaToya also began working with domestic abuse awareness organizations. In 2013, she partnered with Youth for Human Rights International to raise awareness about violence against women. She also filmed public service messages speaking on behalf of victims who felt too afraid to come forward, drawing from her own experience of isolation and control. Her message resonated, and slowly the media and the public began treating her story with more seriousness. Over the next decade, she appeared in documentaries, talk shows, and interviews where the tone had shifted completely. Instead of mocking her, hosts listened. They asked real questions, and LaToya answered them directly. Importantly, she didn't rewrite history to protect her image. She acknowledged the damage done, not just to herself, but to her family. In 2009, after Michael Jackson's sudden death, LaToya stood beside her family once again. She helped organize funeral arrangements and made public statements defending Michael against ongoing allegations. In interviews, she said she regretted everything said during her time with Gordon, but she stood firm on the reality of how she was manipulated into it. Following Michael's death, LaToya remained active in preserving his legacy. She joined efforts to support his children and family causes, often avoiding the spotlight unless it involved charitable or advocacy work. She participated in The Apprentice, made appearances in documentaries, and stayed active in human rights causes. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, her public reputation had stabilized. While she never returned to the height of fame her siblings reached, she carved out something arguably more powerful: a reputation rooted in resilience, honesty, and survival. Her claims of abuse within the Jackson household were never legally contested by her family. In fact, in later years, other Jackson siblings, including Michael and Janet, also publicly described their father Joe as a harsh, often violent disciplinarian. Michael told Oprah in 1993 that Joe would beat him with belts and extension cords. Janet echoed this in later interviews, saying their father was very tough and that fear ruled their childhood. What LaToya said first, and was attacked for, would eventually be echoed by others, not with the same words, but with the same truth. And that's the part the streets haven't forgotten. For years, LaToya Jackson was called a liar, a traitor, and an embarrassment. But time, documents, court records, and the words of her own siblings have painted a clearer picture. What once seemed outrageous now feels more like an early warning, a truth that was hard to hear, but harder to deny.
I haven't been successful with that at all.
What do you think about these allegations?
I'd rather not discuss that because I'm here for this and I'm not here for that. But again, they're just allegations, and I love him and I stand by him.
In terms of Pepsi Cola just having dropped your brother Michael, and that he has admitted that he has a problem with painkillers and is seeking professional help, what is your comment on that?
I have no comment.
You're not concerned about him at all?
I didn't say I wasn't concerned. I did not say that. I said I have no comment on that.
That will be all for now. Please like, comment, and share. Goodbye.